Chapter 7. Alex. It was Christian interrupting the calm I'd managed to capture for myself for a few moments. I jumped once I realized he was near. Nevertheless, I had too much time to think of Max, and my desire to be in his strong, soothing arms, lying with my head on his chest and raking my fingers through his dark curly chest hairs. Looking into the mirror, I smiled, forgetting Christian had been standing behind me. My thoughts continued even as Christian waited for me to acknowledge him. I couldn't see him, for seeing Max even in the mirror, I continued my daydream of him. When Max had been sleeping in and it had gotten late, I'd wake him and he'd turn over and pull me down and open my legs, and he'd have his face on my mound and his tongue on my clit. I'd pulled his hair, directing him until I'd been fully satisfied. I'd look up at him begging for more, and he would continue to suck my clit with his masterful tongue and bring me to climax. Oh, but that was what I lived for, to be loved in that way by the most handsome and sought-after man alive. Max would give me a sexy, sly smile and with his powerful hands flip me on my stomach, paddle my ass to take my mind off what he would do next. He'd drag me to the end of the bed with my head and breasts on the mattress, open my buttocks, lick my hole, and then stand and ease himself inside me. Oh, fuck me, but he knew how to distract me from the first sign of pain. He'd suck my neck as he pulled my hair, and then he'd plunge deeper until I couldn't feel the pain anymore. "Why are you smiling to yourself, Alex, like a mad woman?" I didn't hear him, and perhaps I didn't want him to interfere in my thoughts. And perhaps I was mad. Angry that I'd been neglected by him and by Max. "Are you listening to me, Alex?" "I've been talking to you for the last few minutes," Christian barked when I stopped staring at him and focused on his eyes and his tight jaw. I'd notice when he was angry and couldn't control himself, he'd bite his lip, and then it would quiver. When I glanced over, Christian had strolled around and was clicking his fingers trying to get my attention, and behind him was a rack full of clothing pushed into my stateroom by a man in a white uniform. The man had bowed, nodded his head at me, and then left. I never paid attention to the crew, but I thought he was the same man who had brought me breakfast and supper. There was something peculiar about that guy with a buzz cut that perhaps had been thick mane of dark curls before he shaved the sides of his head. I felt I knew him. If he'd stayed longer, I'd have pinpointed just where I'd seen him before, but he behaved as if he didn't want me to know because he lowered his head and wouldn't meet my eyes. "This is what I want you to wear," Christian said. It wasn't a question like, "Is this what you want to wear?" but a statement, and that statement left no room for me to say no. "Are you out of your mind?" "I'm a married woman, and I have children, or had." My chest rose and fell at that thought. The thought that I would never see them again. I thumbed through the other clothing, thinking that perhaps I could fix the garments by wearing something to disguise the low-cut one-piece gown. Maybe he'd wanted me to wear it to the pool, but the items he'd placed here was something I wouldn't be caught dead in, no less flaunting in front of his guest. Didn't he know that? Of course he knew, but he didn't give a flying fuck how I felt. This was all about him, and I was just a piece of merchandise to show off like a painting. But I wasn't the kind of painting or picture that men admired. I would be a picture where a man would jack off to. "Why am I expected to wear this at a party?" I said, after gathering my courage, pointing to a sheer gown. He hadn't completely broken me, where I would go along with his madness without objecting. I'd say Max had done a good job of that lately, but there was no way I'd let this man do the rest. I strolled around, passing my hand to feel the material, and I remembered how it had been for me and Max, and on that stand there was nothing but black leather clothing, and that's all. There were leather and patent leather pants, vests, bras, and boots. An occasional leather outfit that had panels to my ankles, but my thighs and body were completely exposed with these. Reaching for one of the many toys on the frame, I turned with the Cat O9 tail wrapped firmly in my hand. "What do you expect me to do with this?" I ground my teeth, holding up the whip in the other hand. "Lash a couple of your guests on the ass," I said. I didn't expect an answer, at least not the one he gave me. "If my guests asked you to go to the playroom, and he or she asked you whip his or her ass, then you'd be expected to do that." He smiled. I narrowed my gaze, expecting at any moment that Christian would say, "Got you, of course not, you're my wife." I waited for those words, and when he stared at me without an expression, and then offered me a cold, closed smile, I walked away and turned my back. After regaining my composure and part of my sanity, and after realizing I'd made a gigantic mistake with this man, I turned on the balls of my feet and met his eyes and said, "Am I missing something?" "No, my dearest beautiful lady, you aren't missing a thing. You agreed to marry me, and I expect to get something for my time and money. I'm not a piece of merchandise that you can barter or give away. I'm your wife. I own you. You sold yourself to me for millions, and now you're like any other property I own. I can sell you if I want. But I don't want. At least not now." The hair on my arms rose, and it finally connected with me, who I was dealing with. A man who had all the money in the world, and if I didn't serve him, he'd sell me. Christian sauntered behind me and wrapped his fist around my hair, and I felt a chill travel down my spine, and then he pulled it so hard tears welled in my eyes. "You're hurting me, Christian." He released my hair and said, "Sorry, darling, but I thought you were used to pain. I heard you and Maximilian had a very storied life together, filled with murder, mayhem, and pain. Where did you hear such a thing? And it's not true. None of it is." I walked closer to Christian, not wanting him to know how afraid I was, but I'd still challenge him nonetheless. "Well, I heard you can't have sex the traditional way. Is that why you haven't touched me?" I said, trying to hurt someone that was incapable of being hurt. If that was the case, then I was in a shitstorm and there was no way out of this I could think of, but I had to think and act soon. Looking around at the water and no land in sight, I couldn't dive into the Gulf and hope to make it to shore. I didn't know where we were at the moment. I had no choice but to go along with him and hope I got out of this with my life intact, because my pride and self-worth would be tested, and I suspect that I would lose both before this was over. "Do you really want me to touch you or have sex with you?" he said, reminding me that he was still standing in my room. "I don't engage in sexual intercourse the traditional way." "No shit. I require more stimulation to get me going, but when I get going I can't stop. With you I would be at it for days and nights and months. Do you really want that?" Christian said, then moved behind me. He leaned and whispered into my ear, and I felt his unholy cock against my ass, and it appeared enormous. The kind that would make an elephant envious. "Do you want that, my dear? Me fucking you in every orifice I can get my huge cock and toys into?" I turned after I'd wiped the horror from my face and eyes. What the fuck had Jonas gotten me into, I wondered. Or better said, what the fuck did I get myself into this time? Jonas did warn me, but I didn't know. I just didn't the fuck know that there were men like him. What am I saying? At the time I came across Max and Jonas, I didn't know anything about their world. But Christian is a cut above the rest when it comes to this kind of thing. Now I began to wonder about his wives. In my eagerness to marry and get money to fight Max, I stumbled into something I had no knowledge of. Where the fuck is Jonas when I need him? My thoughts kept running in a circle and coming back to Jonas. Christian glared at me and reached for one of the bondage costumes from the rack and held it against my body. "You make your choice, and I don't care which of these you choose, and if you must take your time to decide, do so. But I want you out of this stateroom in an hour wearing one of these outfits." His voice had hardened, and he wore a closed smile when his devious eyes bore into me. "Who am I going to be wearing this for?" I dared questioned, because I could see on his face he didn't want anyone to question him. "My guests, of course." His voice had changed from hard to soft. "Why would you parade me in front of strangers?" "They aren't all strangers, remember. I have my reason, beautiful lady." He turned, and when I thought he would leave, Christian swiveled around, faced me, offered me a wide grin, placed his finger in his mouth, and with one hand he raised my gown, and with the other in a quick motion, he nudged his finger inside my thong, and before I could object because I couldn't believe he'd do this, he inserted his wet finger inside my opening. He gave me no indication this was what he'd planned on doing. When he pulled his finger out, he placed it to his nose. "You smell wonderful. But that's not how I like you. I don't want a clean cunt. I want you after some man has ravished you. And your pussy is as wet as it is now." I held my breath and the blood drained from my face. My body went into panic mode, and I swear he smelled it when he raised his nose and smiled at me like a predatory animal before and after the hunt. Then he placed the finger that had been inside me in his mouth and said, "Take that thong off or I'll do it for you." I glared at him, furrowed my brow, praying that he wouldn't go any further, but I did as he'd asked. I was like a caged animal with nowhere to go, but to jump into the ocean or fight back. But how? And when? The answer came to me. You'll know when the time comes. When I stepped out of my thong, I backed up, leaving it on the floor. Christian leaned down, hooked it around his finger, brought it to his nose, smelled it, and then stuffed it into his pocket before leaving my bedroom. I blew out a heavy breath, considered myself lucky for the moment. What next, I thought. I moved to the terrace and wrapped my arms around my body to stay the chills that raced through me. What is Max going to think when he sees me? Why should I care, because he was the one who threw me to the wolves? The wolves will be feasting on me soon. Chapter 8. Max. Christian had invited me and 5 other men to be flown in by helicopter to his yacht. The yacht and the helicopter had been mine once. If I remembered correctly, I had sold him my companies in Europe, and threw in the yacht and helicopter as a bonus to get his business and to rid myself of all my surplus manufacturing businesses that were a drain on my hotels. He'd gotten control of my companies, and now he owns my wife. However, Alex isn't easy to own, or so I thought. Nevertheless, the business arrangement didn't include Alex. She'd planned that on her own, I thought, looking around at the other men sitting quietly but for the sound of the propellers. They may have been consumed by their thoughts, as I had been doing throughout the bumpy ride. The clouds were darkening, and it appeared they were threatening to erupt. What's the saying? Red sky at night, sailor's delight. Red sky in the morning, sailor take warning. I observed the attention had been focused on me, with some men gazing at my attire, and some glared brazenly at me when meeting my eyes, but then quickly lowering their heads when they recognized who they were sitting next to and across from. I guessed once they knew I was Maximilian Blackstone, something clicked in their memory, and they probably had read in the newspapers about me or heard from their friends. Nevertheless, I had a reputation, and it all depended on who had passed the stories around whether that reputation had been good, bad, or sinister. Was this his plan to embarrass me in Alex's eyes, or just an afterthought? I think I knew the answer to that question without giving it any extra thought on my part. At the time I'd offered up my companies to be sold, I'd promised Alex I'd sell everything, and I was on the road to doing that when I had an accident and found Alex in bed with Jonas. I only saw what I wanted. I didn't know Alex thought I was dead, and Jonas's bride had been murdered by her jealous boyfriend. I couldn't see anything but my brother and wife entwined in each other's arms. I couldn't think because of my own jealousy, and I proceeded to extract revenge from the 2 people I thought had harmed me, Jonas and Alex. I didn't know their pain, and I didn't want to know. All I thought about was my selfish needs, and for that I'm now paying a price. When we neared the helipad and ready to land, I caught sight of women sitting around the pool. That's when I realized it had been peculiar that women were invited. However, Alex had asked for the company since this was a party after all. I could have stayed at home, but I wanted to see her beautiful face and talk to her. Beg her to come back with me. Or kidnap her. When we landed, Christian had stepped down the stairs after the pilot had turned off the motor, and the helicopter was silent. We departed, and I climbed out in my tux. Christian appeared to be bothered by my mode of dress. His eyes scanned my body and face. After he'd greeted his guest, he saved me for last. "Happy to see you, Mr. Blackstone. You know it's warm here, but I see you're not sweating. We'll have to take care of that, because as you know it's healthy when you sweat. What the fuck did he mean by that? Normally I would have put that to him in those words, but I was at a disadvantage now. Please don't call me Mr. Blackstone. You make me feel so old. Call me Max. I could look in his eyes and see his contempt for me. He couldn't hide it, because he was too young and never had to. His smirk rose on both sides of his mouth, and I knew exactly how he wanted me to feel, as if I was too old and had lost a step or two, because after all, he was married to my wife now, and that meant something to him but not to me. If me being 40 disarmed him, then so much the better for me. His youth of 25 proved to be a disadvantage too. And I was just the guy to teach him that lesson. I pegged Christian as being greedy. He had my wife, and he wasn't satisfied with that. He had my companies and my prized possessions, so what else did he want to take from me? I thought, offering him a pacifying smile. Yes, I could have stayed home, enjoyed the time I had with my children, and worked from home, but my intentions were to get my wife back by any means necessary. Follow me, Max. You look very handsome and prosperous today. What was that about? No one could be as prosperous as this young man who struts around as if he's king of the world, and he probably is, because I gave up that title for my family, and now I don't have the woman who was my queen who had made that possible. Christian led me to the dining room, where he sat at the head of the table along with two more guests, the captain who he'd positioned next to me. The captain and I had a few words, and I asked him strategic questions about his next destination. He'd informed me that they would be heading for the Mediterranean Sea, that is after they'd traveled west to Cancun, where Christian had a villa along the coast. Then the steward came from the shadows in the back of the room, and stood over the servers to make sure the food was ready, and the waiters were serving it properly. Most of the guest and crew knew Alex had been my wife, and Alex would never be Christian's. In my mind, I would never see her as belonging to anyone but me. Those were my lingering thoughts as I glanced around looking for Alex. When I glanced up, I noticed something about the steward as he passed me, trying to disguise himself. He wore one of those large white hats called a toque blanche, and a white double-breasted coat over a pair of black and white houndstooth pants. I turned quickly to touch his arm when he passed me, but he kept his stride, walking hurriedly away from the table. Christian noticed and turned to me with a questioning glance. I think I recognized one of your crew. You know, this was once my yacht, I reminded Christian to satisfy his curiosity. Narrowing his glance and aiming his body around to see the man. I thought I'd fired most of the previous crew, however, I did find them positions. I'm not that cruel, Christian admitted falsely. Smiling, I turned to him. Perhaps you're out of practice. And I drank the water in a glass with Christian's logo on everything, including the large chandelier overhead. When I glanced in the direction of the steward, he was serving at the far end of another table, but his back was to me, and perhaps I'd been wrong. However, I had been determined to learn if I was right, and I did know this person. Rising from the table after an excuse, I marched over to the man, tapped him on the back, and greeted the man with a smile so Christian wouldn't realize I was fucking angry. I nodded at the steward, still smiling. Can I speak to you a moment? I said, my voice stern but calm. Jonas followed me to the open bar in the corner. Make me a drink. Now what the fuck are you doing here? I glanced over, and Christian was in serious talks with the captain and the first mate, and his eyes weren't focused on me. I thought I told you to stay with my children and make sure they're okay. When the fuck are you going to do what I asked of you for once? It's you who got Alex in this shit. Then it will have to be me who will get her out, Jonas barked in a smothered voice. He placed a dirty martini in front of me. I reached and drank it. I needed it. Trust me, Max. I've already trusted you more than I should, and look where's it's gotten me, I said, raising an eyebrow and furrowing my brow to let Jonas know that we're not dealing with one of his lawyer friends who don't have any money. This man is perhaps richer than the both of us. He can buy and sell us and make us disappear if we fuck this up. And I don't know what he'll do to Alex. My children could be without both parents, I whispered with a sturdy "don't fuck this up" voice. There's something you should know. I didn't like the sound of Jonas's voice, and because he was willing to admit something to me. That wasn't like him. Jonas never tells me anything unless it's beyond his control, or he's in deep into shit. I don't have time now, Jonas. Christian fucking freak is calling you. I turned because I didn't want my talk with the steward to be suspicious, so I headed back to the captain's table with Jonas. Steward, will you tell my wife we're expecting her for dinner? I glanced at Jonas. Yes. I'll tell her. Jonas had disguised his voice. He was nervous, and I didn't know why, and I didn't have time to listen when he'd said, "There's something you should know." What the fuck is it? I wondered, as I sat at the table between the captain and Christian. Chapter 9. Alex. When I dressed, I had been afraid to look into the mirror. But I had to. Maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought. Perhaps everyone would think Christian had played a joke, or I was playing a joke on them. However, they would have to be blind not to see the obvious. No one dresses like this in public unless they're mentally deranged. Perhaps that was his motive. Maybe he was gaslighting me, and he'd embarrassed me in front of everyone. Yeah, that has some truth to it. He wants his guests to think I've gone off the deep end and get rid of me. That would work. Yet I knew that was fanciful thinking. It wouldn't be that easy. I stood gazing at myself dressed. I couldn't imagine anyone dressing like this in front of people unless. I didn't want to think about the alternatives, because that was too frightening. I knew Christian had married me for the wrong reasons, but this having me looking like a slut or worse. I never thought he'd force this on me and Max. I could stay in my stateroom and defy him, I thought. What is he going to do? However, he'd already spelled out his intentions if I didn't obey him, so I hooked the choker around my neck, then flicked the gown up and straightened my boots. Every moment I delayed and saw myself in the mirror, I considered the consequences, but he'd warned me he would have someone drag me out and bring me to him. Did I want that? Of course not. Max would know everything, and whatever leverage I'd had would be lost. As I sauntered to the door passing too many mirrors where I couldn't believe what I'd been looking at, I opened the door thinking it was Christian, and I'd have another chance to convince him I was his wife and not a piece of ass he'd found on the streets. However, with someone like Christian, everything was a commodity where they could be bought and sold. I didn't understand his thinking, and I knew I had to get away from him, even if it meant leaving empty-handed. Jonas would take care of me if there wasn't any way out of this. The door swung open. I stood and stared. At that moment I recognized Jonas's emerald eyes, his pampered teeth, and his handsome face. I recognized him. What the? Jonas placed his finger to my mouth to remind me not to call his name. Then he walked cautiously around and checked for mics, and when he was sure I wasn't being bugged or spied on, he strolled up to me. What the fuck is this about? Why are you dressed like that, Alex? You can't leave this cabin dressed in that shit. I thought when I delivered those clothes that you were doing this for Christian. Do you know what you look like? Don't remind me. If I remember correctly, I'd worn the same type of thing when you'd asked me to do you a favor to get you out of trouble. Jonas cut me off in the middle of reminding him how he'd gotten me into all kinds of shit with Max. Because of Jonas owning a bondage club, he had been up to his neck in debt, and had to pay off a syndicate, and that's where I came in. Jonas had bragged about knowing a dominatrix who could bring any man to orgasm with one flick of her whip. That was me, all right, but that was for my husband Max, and now he's no longer my husband. I'm longing for Max every day because Christian will see that I'm giving pleasure to all his friends and associates by selling me to the highest bidder. I can dress in these outfits or whatever if it means this day will be over, and I can still salvage something of myself, Jonas. I closed my eyes for a moment and fell into Jonas's arms. He took a long look at me and passed his thumb under my eyes to wipe away the tears that had pooled. Droplets of tears finally filled my pained eyes. I hadn't allowed myself to feel remorse for what I'd done to myself and everyone, especially my children. I couldn't afford to even cry now because there was too much at stake, and I had to see this night through. Then figure out how to get out of this place and out of Christian's life forever. But Max is in the dining room having dinner and drinks with your husband. He'll be watching you. Those words almost choked Jonas, I knew, because they left a sour taste in my mouth too, and from the expression on Jonas's face, his mouth tightened, it twisted to the side where he bit his bottom lip and shook his head and said, "No. No. You can't do this, Alex." "I have to. I have no choice." I laid my head on Jonas's chest, where he smoothed his palm over my hair and held me close in his arms. If I wanted to cry, I had his permission, but I couldn't now. I wrapped both arms around his small waist and he rocked me. This took me back to my first experience with Jonas. We both had been homeless in Seattle when I was a teen running away from a group home, and he was a returning soldier just out of Afghanistan and living on the streets because he'd been damaged during the war, and he didn't understand how to ask his brother Max for help. "What's wrong with that man?" Jonas asked me. How could he take a beautiful young woman and degrade her in front of his friends and her ex-husband? He knew how much Max loved you, or he wouldn't have done this. Jonas pulled me from his chest where he could look at me. "I don't want you to go out there like that. I forbade you, Alex." "Are you listening to yourself, Jonas? Now you sound like Max, and you know where that got him with me. Now you. I got myself into this, and I'm damn well going to see it through, and get this behind me whatever happens come hell or high water. Seeing this through could be detrimental to your health and well-being, not to mention your mental state. Have you thought about that, Alex? This man can do a lot of damage in a short time. I can tell by the way he's handling you, cold and calculating. Then you will have to blame your brother for my mental state, because he was the one who set all this in motion. He's as culpable as anyone, including myself. Now I don't want to talk anymore about why I'm not objecting to this. I just need to figure out how to get away from Christian, and it can't be done while I'm on this ship." I sucked in a heavy breath and exhaled. "I'll know what to do once this is over," I whispered, studying Jonas's sad, amazing, soft, caring eyes. I glanced up at Jonas, and I knew he was trying to come to terms with what he was seeing before him. I was dressed in a long black sheer gown with 2 slits up to my thighs and beyond. I was being conservative. It was up to my pubic hair, as if that was all that was on display. The gown was so sheer I could have been naked, and my nakedness would have provided more covering. As if that wasn't enough, he demanded that I wear a leather choker around my neck, and my wrists sported black leather and chrome cuffs. I held out my wrists for Jonas. "I think Christian has other motives for having me dressed like this, and I don't want to contemplate what he's planning for me. Right now, I'm trying to do what he wants, follow his orders, and hope he doesn't do something to piss off Max. Tell Max not to react no matter what Christian does to me tonight. He's planning something, I know, and it's aimed at Max. This wasn't hard to figure out. I'm the weapon intended to destroy Max," I said, finding comfort in Jonas's arms once more. I knew he had it in for Max when he started buying all the properties Max held. Max didn't see it, and I didn't have enough information, because Max never let me in on the business side, even if the money he'd been spending was mine too. Max had said he needed to spend more time with you, and this isn't about me, and don't make it, Jonas. There's something neither you nor I know about their previous relationship. When I glanced up at Jonas, from his expression he knew I had been right, because after all, there was a history I knew little of because of the ages of the Blackstones compared to my age and Christian's. Somewhere there was a truth I didn't know about, and I was determined to discover what it was. "Can we go, Jonas? If we stay any longer, Christian will come and maybe walk in here and see us together." Then Jonas picked up a robe and draped it over my shoulders. "I don't know why you should walk around in that outfit for everyone, including his crew, to see. We need to keep this as closed as necessary. Well, good luck, because the livestock have left the barn, and there's no need to put a lock on the door now, I thought. I placed my hand over Jonas's, glanced up at him and said, "Thanks, Jonas. Now let's do this. It's not like I haven't been exposed to someone before." We stepped outside. I raised my head to glance over at an unhappy, beautiful man who happened to look like my handsome ex. "Let's get this the fuck over with," I remarked, and we walked together, not holding hands, which I needed to steady me, because I didn't want to give Christian any reason to suspect Jonas, because I knew I'd need him before this nightmare was over. Jonas stopped. "I never heard you curse like that before." "Perhaps it's because I've been dealing with too many hard men lately,"